Hi, I'm Caren, a Texas beef rancher. On today's video, I'm going to show you my easy recipe for making beef bone broth. Before we get started making beef bone broth, I wanted to share a couple of things with you. One is, I think a lot of recipes and a lot of videos overcomplicate making beef bone broth. Bone broth was a very important food to our ancestors, and I know that it was not, something complicated. They knew that it was very healthy and that you could really extend your food and nutrition by, making bone broth. Because it's something that in the winter that we eat almost every day. And I really feel like a family or a household that keeps bone broth, that you can just come up with a meal and just very, very fast. And I think it's really, really good for your gut health. Another thing I want to talk about is I want to talk to you about the bones you use for bone broth. So I know our ancestors, could not go buy just like, a whole, box of shanks or whatever. They just use the bones that they have, and it just wasn't so complicated. So I want to, kind of talk to you about the bones that I use. So I always start my bone broth with a roast because people don't understand that you do have to have some meat to have a rich stock, real dark, rich stock. So that's important. You can't just go put a bag of bones and expect that. Okay, so, so I'm starting with a roast or like short ribs or something. And so they're called meaty bones, is what I call them. And that would be, my butcher calls them soup bones, but this is the neck, and there's a lot of meat on them. And I will just use these basically for bone broth. And they're a good way without having to use some of the cuts, that I am going to eat. It's a good way to use that meat. Okay, another way that I add meaty bones is for the shanks. So there's a foreshank and a hind shank. It's the round and the top of the leg, and it's got the bone through it. It has, it's really, really nutritious. So I will use, shank, neck bones, start with a roast. Then my butcher does 5-pound bags, and they're just randomly cut. And I don't go defrost all the bags and look for different bones. That would be way too much trouble. So I would just go to the freezer and get a bag of bones out about like this. And I know that, and usually when I'll just go ahead and roast this. But I will do about, maybe 30 or 40% meaty bones, and maybe, and then the rest, bones. Jointy bones, there's knuckle bones, there's the oxtail, but there's only one of those. But I'm not that picky. And I always save my bones from, if we have a steak or if we have just anything that has a bone, I always just stick it in the freezer and I will bring it out. It's already cooked and roasted. I just will bring it out and put it in my bone broth. Also, if we're trimming any kind of like sirloin and making stew meat, I save all of the trimmings, every bit, because it's really impossible not to get every bit of meat. Or even the connective tissues have collagen. So I freeze all of that, and I bring all of that out when I want to make bone broth. And then when I have all of these things, they're all things I have to decide. Am I starting with a roast? Do I have a lot of meat on my trimmings? That is when I decide how much I'm going to use of, how much meaty bones I need to add, and then the jointy bones. So that is my process of how I decide. And now we are going to get started making beef bone broth. To start our bone broth today, I am going to start with making a roast for my family on Sunday. Now I will sear the roast And I will use generous amounts of salt and pepper, just cook a roast the regular way. I will add onions, and I will just barely cover the roast with water. I'll cook the roast, all day Sunday in my Vitaclay, which I love, and I always get a great gel on my bone broth. And then after it's cooked, we will, put it on a platter. We will take all of the meat off of all the connective tissue and bones, and then we put all of that back. And in any broth or stock that we did not use, we put that all back into the Vitaclay. And I usually put a splash of apple cider vinegar when I'm cooking a roast. But I don't make it too complicated, just onions and peppercorns also, and salt and pepper. And a dash of cayenne pepper is how I make my roast. So we'll put that back in the Vitaclay probably on Sunday night. But on Sunday, I will have bones out. I'll gather everything from the freezers, and I will roast the bones in the oven at 350, 30 minutes on each side. So that will really make them rich, and I'll get that brown, rich stock. Of course, I use all the bones from any steaks that we've eaten, any trimmings that I have, and I do not add any more salt. I will put peppercorns, more apple cider vinegar, maybe some onions, a few more, but I never add carrots. Sometimes I'll add, some garlic scapes that I have in the winter, but it just depends on how long I'm going to cook it, because remember, some of those vegetables will float to the top of your bone broth if you're going to cook it for a long time, and they will kind of get charred and burned, and I don't really like that. And I like everything real simple and clean tasting in my palate. So I'll put, around half of the bones I roasted, and then I already have my rich stock for my roast that I had left over from my Sunday meal. And then I put those on Sunday night. I'll cook those, at least all night. And then I will usually go another, possibly, I guess the whole day Monday on warm or a real, real low setting until Monday night. Bone broths are rich in nutrients, minerals, and amino acids. They are so inexpensive to make. They are rich in gelatin. They improve your collagen status, and they are great for digestive health. I always just barely cover my bones. I mean, nothing over an inch. I just make sure they're just covered, and that's the way you will get some really, really rich bone broth. I can't say enough nice things about my Vitaclay, and I have an all-clad slow cooker that I will use as well. But I prefer the Vitaclay for bone broth. But sometimes, actually most of the times, I'll make my first batch of bone broth. That's usually by Monday night. My first batch is finished, and then I'll put it in the refrigerator, and then I will cover the bones again with water, and I will make a real light broth for soups and to, use for rice. But I definitely always do, 2 batches. But I let the bone broth cool a little bit, and then I will strain it into, I really like the half-gallon jars because you really want to cool your broth down quickly. You don't want it to, make a gigantic, 3-gallon batch that it takes forever for the center to cool off. And I have very good success in my bone broth staying, good and not ruining. Of course, always watch your refrigerator temperatures. Always, I think people forget they should have a thermometer in the refrigerator, and always, keep up with that. So you can see there is a fat layer on top of the bone broth. That is like gold for us. So I always chill my bone broth so that I can save the fat. And the video following this one, I will show you how to clean that fat. And I almost have enough just for my bone broth that I'll use my leaf tallow just for pie baking or pastries. But this keeps us in a lot of fat. Some ways that you can store your bone broth is, of course, you can store it in the refrigerator for a week or less. This fat layer will help keep air out, like an anaerobic environment, and it helps keep your bone broth, good for longer. So, I try not to disturb the fat layer until I'm ready to use the broth. You can freeze your broth and you can pressure can your broth. Here are 3 points that I want to share with you about making beef bone broth. The first one is, please do research on the vessel that you are making your bone broth in. There are some safe and unsafe materials that cooking vessels are made of, and I think it's important that you understand and investigate and know the pros and cons of all. Personally, I love using the VitaClay, and I also use glass lids on my slow cookers. The second point that I think is important is calf bones have more collagen. The younger the animal, the more collagen. That is one of the reasons that we harvest our animals at the age that we do. We harvest 9-month-old calves. We think that is the healthiest, and the bone broth is so important to us. The third point that I want to share is, I think that everyone would benefit from having this book. It's The GAPS, Gut and Psychology Syndrome, written by Natasha Campbell McBride. There is a very, very strong focus on healing your gut through bone broth. And historically, we have always treated young children and the infirm with bone broth. It's easy to digest, and I think at this day and time, it would really benefit you to have this book. I want to show you the beef bone broth that I made. I simmered the bone broth in my VitaClay and in my all-clad slow cooker, and then I poured it in jars. This is the first batch after about 24 hours, and it's been in the refrigerator. It's all chilled, and I want to show you how beautiful it is. So this layer of fat that is on top of the bone broth, I will save it and put it in the freezer. And when I have enough stored up, I will cleanse it by putting water on it, melting it, boiling it a little, discarding the water. And I might have to do that possibly like 5 times to get the fat clean. And then I'll use it for things such as roasting potatoes, making tortillas. I don't use this fat though for pastry. I use the leaf lard tallow. Okay, so beautiful. Look at all of the beautiful collagen. It's just like gelatin. I mean, there's really no difference. Look how thick. Wow. Okay, so this is the first batch. So I got almost a gallon. Okay, after I strained this broth, I covered the bones with water again, because I always like to do a light broth. I don't want to waste anything. Okay, this has a little fat, but not as thick. Okay, let's see how thick. Okay, it's thicker, than water liquid, but it doesn't have the collagen and the gelatin at the first batch. But still, it would make a beautiful soup, broth. And you could even try a third time, possibly. I always tell our beef customers to make the most of all of your bones and meat. Thank you for watching our video, and I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe and watch more of our videos. And I hope that you will use my recipe for making simple bone broth, and I hope that you will add it to your diet because it is so good for your family. From our Texas Hill Country Farmstead to you, have a blessed day, and we will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.